The night Vincent Moretti made his choice, the whole city felt it. One bullet, one decision. One man turned his back on the woman carrying his child and ran toward the woman who was already planning his funeral. What happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and what a man is truly willing to destroy to protect his ego. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because this story doesn't just end, it burns everything down first. The rain had been coming down for 6 straight hours by the time Vincent Moretti's convoy rolled into the Carver Street corridor. 3 black SUVs moving slow and deliberate through the kind of neighborhood that didn't ask questions and didn't keep receipts. It was the kind of night where every shadow looked like it was breathing, where the neon from the liquor store on the corner bled red across the wet pavement and made everything look like the aftermath of something that hadn't happened yet. Vincent rode in the middle vehicle. He always did. Not out of caution, out of habit, the same way he wore his watch on his right wrist and drank his espresso black and never apologized for anything he said in the heat of a meeting. He was 41 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been poured into a mold and a mouth that hadn't offered a genuine smile in years. The men around him called him the Roman, a name that had attached itself to him somewhere back in his mid-30s when he'd reorganized 4 separate operations under one umbrella and eliminated 2 rival families in the same fiscal quarter without going to war. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition of something specific, the way he thought in systems, in pressure points, in the geometry of control. Elena was in the second vehicle. His wife of 7 years, 34 years old, 22 weeks pregnant with a daughter they hadn't agreed on a name for yet. She had her heels off, feet tucked under herself on the back seat, reading something on her phone with the dim overhead light cutting across her face. She had dark hair pulled back, a gray coat she'd owned since before they were married, and the kind of bone structure that made painters want to put her in things that didn't move. She'd insisted on coming tonight. Vincent had told her twice it wasn't necessary. She'd looked at him in that quiet, specific way she had, not challenging, not pleading, just steady. And he'd stopped arguing because he'd learned years ago that Elena's quiet was never passive. Her quiet was a form of intelligence. Danielle Reese was in the third vehicle. She was 28, a former events coordinator who'd slid into Vincent's orbit 18 months earlier at a charity dinner he'd attended for the optics of it. She had long legs and an easy laugh, and the gift of making men feel like whatever they were saying was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. Vincent had told himself 100 different stories about what she was to him, a distraction, a release valve, a phase he'd get through, and had believed each story long enough to move to the next one. He'd given her an apartment in Midtown, a car she didn't need, and access to his private calendar, which was the most dangerous thing he'd given anyone outside his inner circle. He didn't think about that last part much. The convoy stopped at the old Harrington Textile Building, 2 floors of it now used for product staging, the rest gutted and dark. The meeting was with representatives from the Calvino network out of Philadelphia, a sit-down about territorial compression along the eastern distribution corridor that had been creating friction for 3 months. Vincent's consigliere, a compact, silver-haired man named Dom Farella, was already inside with 2 of his lieutenants. The arrangement was standard. The meeting was supposed to take 40 minutes. It took 4. The first shot came from the roof of the building across the alley. A single crack, then the windshield of the lead vehicle blew inward, and then everything collapsed into chaos at the speed of something that had been planned for weeks and executed in seconds. Vincent was out of the SUV before the first echo died. Pure muscle memory. 7 years of building an empire meant his body knew what to do before his brain caught up. He hit the pavement low, the rain coming down hard enough to blur his vision at anything past 20 feet. He could hear men shouting, 2 voices cut short in ways that meant they weren't shouting anymore, and the flat, percussive crack of gunfire coming from at least 3 separate positions. Someone grabbed his arm. Paulie Drago, his personal driver, ex-Marine, the kind of man who moved like a piece of furniture until you needed him to move like something else. "We're boxed," Paulie said. Not loud, just close. "East side's covered. They've got the building entrance." "Dom?" Vincent said. "Don't know." "Elena's vehicle. She's out. Her door opened. I can't see her from here." Vincent looked toward where the second SUV had stopped. The rear door was hanging open. He could see the shape of Elena crouched beside the front wheel well, one hand pressed to the vehicle's body, the other flat against her stomach. She wasn't moving. She was doing what he'd told her years ago, early on, in one of those conversations he'd assumed were hypothetical. Stay low, stay behind something solid, don't run until you know where you're running to. He registered her position. He registered that she was visible, partially exposed, that the angle from the eastern rooftop put her in a bad line if she moved toward the back of the vehicle. He registered all of this in approximately 2 seconds, the same 2 seconds in which he heard a sound from the opposite direction, a voice, high and fractured, coming from the far side of the lead SUV. Danielle's voice. She was screaming. Not words, just that specific register of panic that bypasses language entirely. The sound of someone who has never been close to violence before and has just discovered what it actually feels like in the body. One of his security men had her by the elbow, and she was pulling away from him, stumbling, one heel broken, her coat soaked through, her face white as chalk under the rain-smeared mascara. Vincent moved toward her. He didn't decide to. That was the thing he would never be able to fully explain. Not to Polly, not to Dom, not to the part of himself that would keep returning to this moment in the years that followed. His body moved in her direction before his mind had finished the calculation. He told himself later that she was exposed, that she had no training, that she would do something that got herself killed and possibly others along with her. He told himself it was strategic. He told himself a lot of things. He crossed the gap between the vehicles at a low sprint, grabbed Danielle by the arm, and pulled her toward the building's recessed service entrance 15 feet away. She came with him, stumbling and gasping, her nails digging into his forearm hard enough to leave marks he'd noticed 3 days later. Behind him, he heard Elena call his name. Not screaming, not panicked. Just his name, in her voice, the way she said it when something needed his attention. One word, clear under the rain and the gunfire. He heard it. He did not stop. They made it to the doorway. Polly came in behind them a half-second later, and then there was the sound of a shot. Close, too close, the kind of proximity that made the air ring, and a sound from outside that Vincent felt rather than heard, something soft and wrong and final in the way it ended. He looked back through the doorway. Elena was on the ground beside the second SUV. She was on her side, one hand still pressed to the wheel well, the other now flat against the pavement below her. She wasn't moving. There was a man on the far end of the alley, an enemy shooter working a flanking position, who was already redirecting, already swinging his weapon toward the doorway where Vincent was standing, and Polly pulled him back and the door closed and the shooting continued for another 90 seconds before the siren started and the attackers pulled back into the dark. The whole thing, start to finish, was 11 minutes. Vincent didn't go back to Elena's side until the shooting stopped. By then, she had lost enough blood that the paramedics who arrived 8 minutes after the siren started were working with the compressed, wordless urgency of people who understand that some windows close fast. He stood on the edge of that scene and watched them work and felt something in his chest that he couldn't name because he had spent 20 years developing an almost clinical relationship with his own emotions, and the thing that was happening to him now had no category in his internal filing system. She was alive when they loaded her into the ambulance. Danielle was standing 15 feet away, wrapped in a thermal blanket someone had produced from somewhere, watching the ambulance doors close. She had a small cut above her eyebrow from where she'd hit the door frame during the scramble. Someone had already pressed a bandage to it. She looked at Vincent, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. And in that silence, there was a truth that both of them recognized, and neither of them was ready to name out loud. He rode to the hospital in the back of an SUV with Polly driving and Dom Farella sitting across from him with his hands folded on his knees, like a man preparing to say something he'd been rehearsing. Dom was 63, had been with Vincent's father before he'd been with Vincent, and had a face like a topographic map of every mistake the family had ever made. She took her round to the left side, Dom said. That's what Marcus said. Below the ribs. They don't know yet about the baby. Vincent said nothing. She called for you, Dom said. Before the paramedics got there. Marcus heard her. Vincent looked out the window. The rain was still coming down. The streets outside were empty in the way that city streets go empty after something bad has happened nearby. Not abandoned, just cautious, everything holding its breath. "I thought Danielle was—" he started. "Don't," Dom said. Not angry, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Vincent closed his mouth. The hospital waiting room was the kind of place that flattened everyone inside it. The powerful and the ordinary seated in the same plastic chairs under the same fluorescent lights, drinking the same bad coffee out of the same machine, all of them suspended in the same particular uncertainty that money and influence could not buy their way through. Vincent had 2 of his men outside and 1 in the lobby, and none of it meant anything in this room, in this wait, in this specific and irreducible helplessness. Dom sat across from him. The others stayed in the corridor. Polly leaned against the wall near the entrance with his arms crossed, watching the door the way he always watched doors. Not anxious, just present, the way a good piece of infrastructure is present. The surgeon came out at 2:40 in the morning. She was mid-50s, gray-haired, with the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who has delivered enough of these conversations to know that the speed of the delivery doesn't change the content. She looked at Vincent with the particular assessment that medical professionals reserve for next of kin. Not warm, not cold, just calibrated to the specific human standing in front of her. "Your wife is stable," she said. "The bullet didn't hit the spine. Liver involvement, which we've addressed. She's going to need significant recovery time, but the structural damage is manageable." Vincent exhaled. "The pregnancy," the surgeon continued, and her voice shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, just a fraction of a degree, but Vincent caught it because he had spent his entire adult life reading the micro-adjustments in other people's voices. The fetal heart rate was already compromised when she came in. The blood loss, the stress. We did everything we could. The room was very quiet. "The baby didn't survive," the surgeon said. Vincent heard the words. He processed them. He sat with them the way you sit with something you knew was coming, but kept finding reasons to believe wouldn't arrive. He thought about Elena in the alley, her hand pressed flat against her stomach, the specific gesture she'd been making for weeks, unconscious, habitual, protective. And he thought about the 2 seconds in which he had seen her position and calculated her exposure and turned away from it. He thought about her voice saying his name. He stayed at the hospital until 5 in the morning, until they told him Elena was out of recovery and resting, and that he would not be able to see her until morning. Then he went back to the car and sat in the dark in the parking structure for a long time. And when Polly finally asked him where he wanted to go, he gave an address that was not his home. It was Danielle's apartment. He was there when the sun came up. He told himself it was because he needed to think, needed quiet, needed to be somewhere that didn't ask anything of him. He told himself a lot of things that morning, in the way that people tell themselves things when the true version of events is too precise and too damning to sit with directly. Danielle made coffee and didn't speak much, and he was grateful for the silence, even as he understood, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that the silence was not neutral. It was the silence of a woman who understood the situation she was in and was smart enough not to complicate it with words. He went to see Elena 2 days later. She was in a private room on the 4th floor, the kind of room that money arranged. Quieter than the standard wards, better light. A window with something other than a wall to look at. She was propped against pillows, her left side wrapped, an IV in her arm, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he almost never saw it during ordinary life. She looked like herself, but quieter, as if some volume that was always running beneath the surface had been turned down to a frequency he couldn't quite locate. She looked at him when he came in. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He put his hand near hers on the blanket but didn't cover it. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. He said it in the particular way that men say it when they mean it, but also know that the meaning doesn't cover the distance required. Elena looked at the window while he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You heard me call your name." It wasn't a question. Vincent said, "Yes." Another silence, longer. The machines in the room made their small ambient sounds. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. "I want you to go," Elena said. "Elena." "I'm not saying it twice," she said. Still quiet. Still that turned down register. But underneath it, something he recognized from 7 years of knowing her well. A decision already made, not in this room, not in this conversation, but somewhere in the hours and days of lying in this bed alone while he had been elsewhere. Somewhere she had gone by herself and come back from with her mind already set. He left. He went back to his office and his meetings and his operations and the particular machinery of power that required his attention and presence regardless of what had happened 3 nights earlier in the rain on Carver Street. He told himself Elena needed time. He told himself she would come around. He told himself the loss of the baby was something they could absorb, together, eventually, when the immediate damage had softened into something more manageable. He went on telling himself these things for 3 weeks, while Elena recovered in the hospital and then was discharged to the family house in Westchester, where she had asked specifically that he not be present during the first days of her return. He accommodated this. He stayed in the city. He framed it as respect for her recovery. He went to Danielle's apartment more evenings than he went to his own house, and he didn't examine that arithmetic too closely. What he didn't know, what he had no mechanism for knowing, because the particular blindness he was operating under was total and self-reinforcing, was that Elena was not simply recovering, she was working. She had made 2 phone calls from the hospital that she had not told him about. One was to a forensic accountant she had retained quietly, 18 months earlier, after noticing certain anomalies in the family's asset, reporting that she had never been able to completely explain. The second was to a woman named Sylvia Chen, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned to private practice and who Elena had met once at an event 3 years ago, and whose card she had kept in the inner pocket of her gray coat ever since. Not because she knew why, but because she was Elena Brooks, and she kept things she thought might matter. The accountant's name was Harold Voss. He was 62, meticulous, and had the particular gift of following money through the places it didn't want to be followed. He had been building a file for 14 months. When he came to see Elena at the hospital 3 days after her surgery, he brought 22 pages of documentation that outlined the movement of approximately $8 million from the family's shared holdings into accounts that Elena's name had never appeared on. She read all 22 pages. Then she asked him to keep building. Dom Farella came to see her the same week. He came alone, without announcement, and he sat in the chair that Vincent had sat in and looked at Elena with the expression of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and is beginning to suspect he's been carrying it in the wrong direction. "How bad is it?" Elena said. Not a question. "Bad enough," Dom said. She waited. "The Calvino meeting was compromised before we got there," Dom said. "Somebody fed them our route, our timeline, our vehicle configuration." "Who had access to that?" Dom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 people on our side, me, Polly, and whoever had access to Vincent's calendar." Elena looked at the window. "The apartment he keeps in Midtown," Dom said. "I think you know whose name isn't on the lease." "I know," Elena said. Dom nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. He was a man of a certain generation and a certain code, and there were things he expressed through action rather than language. What he said instead was, "Whatever you need, whatever I can do, you tell me." Elena looked back at him. She studied his face for a long moment with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. Then she said, "I need you to keep showing up for him, exactly as you always have. Can you do that?" Dom understood immediately what she was asking and what it would cost him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." "Good," Elena said. "Don't tell anyone you came here." He left. Elena lay back against the pillows. Outside the window, the city continued its ordinary business, indifferent and enormous, moving through the ordinary Wednesday afternoon without any awareness of the thing that had just been set in motion in a private room on the 4th floor. She reached for her phone. She dialed Sylvia Chen. "I'm ready to talk," she said when Sylvia picked up. She listened to Sylvia's response. Then she said, "No, not yet, but soon. I need 6 more weeks." She hung up. She put the phone face down on the blanket. She pressed her right hand flat against her left side, feeling the bandaging beneath the hospital gown, feeling the dull specific ache that lived there now and would live there for months. She breathed through it. She didn't cry. She had already done that. In the first night, in the dark, alone in this room with the machines and the IV and the specific silence of a woman who has just been told that the daughter she was 22 weeks into knowing will not arrive in the world the way she had imagined. She had cried then, fully, without restraint, for hours, and she had felt the full weight of it, and then she had put it somewhere inside herself where it would stay, intact and permanent, a fact about the world that nothing would ever change or redeem or make sense of. But Elena Brooks had understood something years ago, something she had never articulated to Vincent because she wasn't sure he had the capacity to receive it without turning it into something about himself. That grief and purpose were not opposites. That the deepest losses didn't require you to stop moving. They required you to move with more precision than you had before, with more clarity about what mattered and what could be taken from you and what could not. She had lost her daughter. She had not lost herself. She picked up her phone again. She opened the notes application. She began to type, carefully and methodically, everything she remembered about the anomalies in the asset reports. Dates, amounts, the names of shell entities that Voss had traced, the pattern of transfers that began approximately 16 months ago, right around the time that Danielle Reese had entered the picture. She typed for a long time. Outside, the afternoon moved into evening. The light through the window changed from gray to amber to the particular dark blue of a city night, and Elena kept typing, her face still, her jaw set, the pain in her side a steady presence she had simply decided not to be deterred by. 2 floors below, a nurse who had come on for the evening shift asked the charge nurse about the woman in 412. The charge nurse said she was recovering well, better than expected. The nurse said that was good. The charge nurse said it wasn't luck, said she'd seen hundreds of patients in those rooms, and you could tell, sometimes, in the first few days, the ones who'd already decided they were going to make it, and the ones who were still deciding. Said the woman in 412 had made her decision before the ambulance doors opened. The nurse nodded and moved on to her rounds. In room 412, Elena Brooks finished her notes, put the phone on the bedside table, and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to be still for a moment, in the dark, with everything she knew and everything she was going to do with it, before the next day began. 3 weeks away, in the family house in Westchester, a room waited for her with a window that faced the garden. She had already decided what she was going to do in that room. She had already decided what she was going to ask Harold Voss to find, and what she was going to ask Dom Farella to confirm, and what she was going to ask Sylvia Chen to prepare. Vincent was in the city, in Danielle's apartment, telling himself stories. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he had left in the rain on Carver Street, the woman he had turned away from when she said his name, the woman who had pressed her hand against her stomach to protect a daughter who didn't survive, the woman who had made 2 phone calls from a hospital bed 3 days after major surgery, was already 6 moves ahead of him in a game he hadn't yet realized he was losing. He had no idea that the empire he had built, brick by brick, alliance by alliance, over 20 years of ruthless and precise work, was about to be dismantled by the one person he had always underestimated because she never raised her voice. He had no idea that the night he chose Danielle over Elena on Carver Street, he hadn't just abandoned his wife. He had made an enemy of the smartest person in his world, and that enemy had just told Sylvia Chen she needed 6 more weeks. The 6 weeks Elena asked for did not feel like 6 weeks. They felt like the particular compression of time that happens when a person is moving through grief and strategy simultaneously, when the body is healing at its own pace and the mind is operating at a different speed entirely, faster and colder, and more deliberate than anything the body would sanction if given a vote. She was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday morning, transported to the Westchester house in a car that Dom arranged without telling Vincent the specific timing, and she walked into the front entrance of a house she had lived in for 6 years and felt, for the first time, that it did not belong to her in any way that mattered. She went to the room with the window that faced the garden. She sat down. She opened her laptop. Harold Voss arrived at 10 that morning and stayed until 3 in the afternoon. And by the time he left, the file on the dining room table had grown from 22 pages to 39. The additional 17 pages were specific and damning in the particular way that financial documentation is damning. Not dramatic, not emotional, just precise and irrefutable, and ugly in the way that only the truth can be ugly when it's been hiding in plain sight. The transfers had started 16 months ago, incremental at first, the kind of amounts that could be explained away as operational costs if you weren't looking for a pattern. But Voss had been looking for a pattern, and the pattern was there, and it pointed in one direction with the kind of consistency that eliminated coincidence as an explanation. $8.4 million, moved through 3 shell entities, all of them registered in Delaware, all of them with addresses that traced back to the same registered agent firm in Wilmington. The beneficial ownership on 2 of the 3 entities was deliberately obscured. The third one had been set up more carelessly, and in that carelessness was a name. Not Danielle Reese's name, not yet, but a name Elena recognized. A man named Curtis Webb, who she knew as a contractor who handled IT infrastructure for 2 of the family's legitimate businesses, and who she had met exactly once, at a dinner 18 months ago, seated 2 chairs away from a woman in a red dress who had spent the evening making Vincent feel like the center of the known universe. She wrote Curtis Webb's name on a separate piece of paper and put it in her coat pocket. She called Sylvia Chen that evening. "The accountant's finished his preliminary work," Elena said. "And," Sylvia said, "it's enough to open a conversation. It's not enough to close one." "What do you still need?" "I need to know where the money went after it cleared the shell companies, and I need something that connects the information leak, the one that compromised the Carver Street meeting, to the same source." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "That second part is harder. That's operational. That's not financial paper." "I know," Elena said. "I'm working on it." She hung up and went to stand at the window. The garden was going dormant for winter, the beds covered, the trees stripped down to their structural forms, everything reduced to its essential architecture. She had planted 3 of those trees herself, in the first year she and Vincent had owned the house, back when the idea of a garden had seemed like a reasonable thing to invest in. She thought about the daughter she had almost named Mara. Then she stopped thinking about it, deliberately, the way you close a door in a house where you've decided not to live anymore, firmly and without looking back at the room. She went to bed at 10 and was awake at 5 and did not consider this insomnia. She considered it time. Vincent called twice during that first week. She answered once, briefly, gave him enough to confirm she was alive and recovering, and ended the call in under 4 minutes. He didn't push. She wasn't sure if that was respect or relief, and she had stopped trying to determine which one it was because the answer didn't change what she was doing. What she needed now was inside the organization. What she needed was someone who had been watching, who had been counting, who had reached the specific threshold of disillusionment that makes a loyal person decide that loyalty is a contract, and contracts can be voided when the other party stops holding up their end. She called Marcus Tate. Marcus was 36, a former Army intelligence analyst who had come into the family's orbit 5 years earlier through a contact of Dom's, and who had risen quietly into a position that defied easy categorization. Not quite an enforcer, not quite an analyst, something between the two that the organization had never formally named, but had come to depend on, in the particular way that organizations depend on people who are better at their jobs than anyone wants to explicitly acknowledge. He was the one who had heard Elena call Vincent's name on Carver Street. He was the one who had told Dom. She didn't call him to his personal number. She arranged it through Dom, indirectly, a meeting at a coffee shop in White Plains that nobody from the city would wander into by accident. She was there first, at a corner table, with a coffee she'd been nursing for 20 minutes by the time Marcus came through the door. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been holding something and has been waiting for someone to be ready to receive it. He sat down across from her. He ordered nothing. He put his hands flat on the table. "You're moving better than I expected," he said. "I'm moving exactly as well as I need to," she said. He nodded. "Tell me about the weeks before Carver Street," she said. "Not what you reported to Vincent. What you actually saw." Marcus breathed in through his nose. He looked at the table, then he looked at her. "You already know some of it," he said. "I know the financial side," she said. "I need the operational side. Who had access to the route? Who confirmed the vehicle configuration to people who weren't on our team? If I tell you this," Marcus said, "I'm done. You understand that. Whatever happens after, I'm out." "I know," she said. "Is that acceptable to you?" He was quiet for a long moment. A couple came in through the door, laughing about something, and the door let in a cold draft that moved through the coffee shop and then died. Marcus watched them go to the counter. Then he said, "The week before the Carver Street meeting, there were 3 planning conversations. 2 in the office, 1 at the house on Pelham. I was in all 3. So was Dom. So was Paulie." He paused. "And there was a 4th conversation that I wasn't in that nobody told me about. I found out about it because I saw the calendar entry had been moved, rescheduled, and then deleted. Somebody accessed Vincent's calendar, made a note of the change, and then cleaned up after themselves." "But not completely," Elena said. "Not completely," Marcus said. "There's a version history on the shared calendar system. The access log showed an external device. IP address traces back to a residential building in Midtown." Elena said nothing. She just looked at him steadily. "I know the building," Marcus said. "I know who lives there." "So do I," Elena said. Another silence. Marcus looked at his hands. "I should have brought this to Vincent," he said. "I know that. I didn't because—" He stopped. "Because you weren't sure what he'd do with it," Elena said. "Because I was pretty sure he'd bury it," Marcus said. Elena nodded. She picked up her coffee. She drank the last of it. It was cold. "I need the access log documentation," she said. "Whatever you can get me that shows the external device, the IP, the timestamp." "That's asking me to take something out of the system," Marcus said. "Yes," Elena said. "I know what I'm asking." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away, didn't soften the ask, didn't offer him anything beyond the simple truth of the request and what it meant. "Give me 4 days," he said. She drove back to Westchester alone and did not feel triumphant because what Marcus had just described was not a victory. It was a confirmation of something she had already known, and confirmation of the worst things you already know is not satisfying. It's just heavier. Dom came by 2 days later with food he'd had sent from a restaurant in the city that Elena had liked before everything changed. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony and sat down across from her, and they ate together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have known each other long enough to not require words to fill space. Halfway through the meal, Dom said, "He's been at her apartment 4 nights out of the last 7. Elena cut a piece of food very precisely. She did not look up. "I know," she said. "His captains are talking," Dom said. "Not to him, to each other." "What are they saying?" Dom set down his fork. He folded his hands on the table the way he did when what came next was important. "Sal Benedetti had a sit-down with Tony Greco last Thursday. Private. No agenda. The 2 of them haven't had a private conversation in 3 years because they've never needed to." He paused. "People who haven't needed each other in 3 years don't suddenly need each other unless they're calculating something." Elena looked up now. "And you know this because I'm still paying attention," Dom said, "which is more than I can say for the man who's supposed to be running this." That was the longest speech Dom Farella had made in Elena's presence in years. She recognized it for what it was. Not a complaint, not a warning exactly, but the precise and measured statement of a man who has been watching an institution he gave his life to develop a structural crack, and who has finally accepted that saying it out loud is less dangerous than staying quiet. "He's going to have a problem with Benedetti soon," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "Benedetti's already talking to people in Chicago about the Eastern Corridor compression," Dom said. "Vincent doesn't know." "The same compression issue that was the reason for the Carver Street meeting," Elena said. "The same one," Dom said. "Except now the Philadelphia situation is completely unresolved. The Calvino network thinks we hit their representatives first as a provocation, and Vincent's been too distracted to correct that narrative." He picked his fork back up. 3 months ago, he would have had Sal Benedetti at a table inside 48 hours. Sorted it. Done. He shook his head. Now I'm not sure he'd notice if Benedetti walked out the front door. Elena ate. She thought. She said, "What does Sal actually want?" "Clarity," Dom said. "Same thing they all want. They want to know somebody is steering. And they don't believe Vincent is." "They believe Vincent is steering," Dom said. "They just don't believe he's steering toward anything they recognize." That night, Elena lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling of the room with the garden window. The house was quiet in the specific way of large houses at night. Not empty, just spread out, all that space holding its own silence. She thought about the word Dom had used, clarity. She thought about what it meant for men like Sal Benedetti and Tony Greco and the others who had built their livelihoods on the assumption that the person at the top of the structure was making decisions based on the organization's interests rather than their own appetites. She thought about what it would mean to give them that clarity. Not yet. Not until she had everything. Not until the file was complete and the documentation was solid and Sylvia Chen had been fully briefed and the path was set and irreversible. But soon. Marcus delivered the access log documentation on a Thursday, 11 days after their meeting in White Plains. He left it in an envelope with a contact at a dry cleaner in Terrytown that Dom had arranged, and Elena picked it up herself, without telling anyone, driving there in a car she'd borrowed from a neighbor under the pretense of an errand. She opened the envelope in the parking lot, read through the 3 pages inside, and sat with them for a long time. The timestamp on the external calendar access was 11:47 p.m., 10 days before the Carver Street meeting. The IP address traced to the Midtown residential building Marcus had named. The device ID was a tablet that did not belong to any member of the organization's official network. Someone had accessed Vincent's calendar from Danielle Reese's apartment, noted the Carver Street meeting details, and cleared the immediate log, but not the version history, because clearing the version history required administrator credentials that Danielle didn't have. She had been careful. She just hadn't been careful enough. Elena put the pages back in the envelope. She drove home. She called Sylvia Chen from the driveway, still sitting in the borrowed car with the engine running. "I have the financial documentation and the operational link," Elena said. "I'm ready to move to the next stage." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Once we start the next stage, we can't stop it. You understand that?" "Yes," Elena said. "And you're sure?" Elena looked at the front of the house. The lights were on in the entrance hall, the same lights that had been on in that entrance hall for 6 years, every night she'd come home to this house. She thought about walking through that door for the first time 7 years ago, with Vincent's hand at the small of her back, both of them younger and more optimistic than she could now quite remember being. She thought about the daughter who would never see this house, or any house, who had been 22 weeks into existing and had been taken out of existence by a bullet that was meant for the man who had chosen, in the 2 seconds that mattered, to run in the opposite direction. "I'm sure," Elena said. She hung up. She went inside. She went directly to the dining room table where the file was, and she sat down, and she began to prepare the summary document that Sylvia had asked for, a clear, structured account of every element of evidence, organized in the order it would need to be presented. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. She did not eat. She did not check her phone. She just wrote, precisely and completely. And when she was done, she read it back through once from the beginning, and she changed 2 sentences and left the rest. She printed it. She put it in a folder. She put the folder in the inner pocket of her gray coat. She called Sylvia one more time. "Tomorrow," Elena said. Then she went to bed and slept for the first time in 3 weeks without waking in the middle of the night. In the city that same evening, Vincent was sitting across from Sal Benedetti in a booth at the back of a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that the family had used for private dinners for 15 years. It had taken Dom 4 days to arrange the meeting after Benedetti had stopped returning Vincent's calls directly. That alone should have told Vincent something. It didn't seem to. The dinner was tense in the specific way of dinners where one person knows what's wrong and the other person suspects something is wrong but is too proud to ask directly. Vincent ordered scotch and drank the first one too fast and ordered a second. Benedetti ate methodically and said little. He was 61, a large man who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned a long time ago that size alone was insufficient and that the men who lasted were the men who thought before they moved. "The Philadelphia situation," Vincent started, "is 4 months old," Benedetti said. He didn't say it aggressively. He said it the way you state a fact you've stated before to someone who keeps not responding to it. "I know," Vincent said. There have been complications. There are always complications, Benedetti said. That's what the work is. The question is whether the complications are being managed or whether they're being allowed to compound. Vincent said, I'm managing it. Benedetti looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Benedetti went back to his food and said, Tony Greco's operation in the corridor lost 30% of its routing capacity last month because the Philadelphia thing is still open and nobody's moved to close it. 30%. That's not a complication. That's a wound. I know what it is, Vincent said. Then act like it, Benedetti said. Still not aggressive, still just flat and precise and honest in the way that men speak when they have decided that the alternative, careful political diplomacy, has stopped working. Vincent felt something move through him. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated than anger, something that had been building for weeks, and that he hadn't found a clean outlet for. A kind of pressure that had nowhere to go because everywhere he tried to direct it, it ran up against a fact he wasn't dealing with. I'll have someone at the Philadelphia table by end of next week, he said. End of next week, Benedetti repeated. You have my word. Benedetti put his fork down. He looked at Vincent again with that specific, measured look. Vincent, he said, I've known you for 12 years. I knew your father before that. I'm going to say something that I'm saying as one of those things, not the other. Vincent waited. The men are worried, Benedetti said. Not about Philadelphia, not about the Eastern Corridor. They're worried about you, about where your head is, about whether you're making decisions based on what's good for the organization or based on something else. He paused. Something personal. The restaurant was quiet around them. The ambient sounds of other diners, cutlery, the low register of music from somewhere, all of it continuing indifferently. Vincent said, My personal life is my business. Your personal life became my business, Benedetti said, the night somebody fed our route to the people who hit us on Carver Street. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Vincent felt it in his chest, a physical sensation, something contracting. What are you saying? Vincent said. I'm saying what I said, Benedetti said. I'm saying the men are asking questions that I can't answer because you haven't answered them for me. He picked up his glass. He drank. He set it down. And I'm saying that if those questions don't get answered, and soon, the answers are going to start coming from somewhere else. And you and I both know what that means. He left 20 minutes later, before the dessert course, after shaking Vincent's hand with the particular correctness of a man performing a courtesy he no longer fully means. Vincent sat in the booth alone with his second scotch, and a third he'd ordered somewhere in the middle of the conversation, and felt the specific sensation of a man standing on ground he has just realized is not as solid as it looked. He called Danielle on the way home. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, slightly sleepy, with that ease she always had, that particular quality of complete availability that he had found so appealing in the beginning, and that he now, for the first time, found himself examining from a different angle entirely. Long night? She said. Yeah, he said. Come over, she said. He almost said yes. He was already directing the driver toward Midtown, the same automatic navigation he'd been running for months. Then something stopped him. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something colder and more analytical, the part of his brain that Benedetti's words had activated, the part that ran threat assessments and probability calculations, and that had been conspicuously dormant lately in all the ways that mattered. He thought about what Benedetti had said, about the route, about the feed. He thought about who had access to his calendar. He sat with that thought for a long time in the back of the car as the city moved past the windows, and Danielle's voice came through the phone asking if he was still there. I'm here, he said. You're quiet, she said. I'm thinking, he said. About what? He looked out the window. He watched the city. He said, Nothing. I'll call you tomorrow. He hung up. He redirected the driver to his own apartment in the city, a place he'd barely been in the last 2 months, and went in and sat down in the dark without turning on the lights. And for the first time in 4 months, he sat still long enough for the question he had been refusing to ask himself to surface completely. He sat with it until 2 in the morning. Then he called Dom. Dom picked up on the third ring, his voice alert in the way of a man who never fully sleeps, who has been waiting for a specific call long enough that when it finally comes, the sound of it doesn't surprise him. "I need to know something," Vincent said. "Ask," Dom said. "The calendar access," Vincent said. "The night before Carver Street." Someone pulled the meeting details off the shared system. Marcus flagged an anomaly weeks ago. I told him to look into it and then I didn't follow up. He stopped. "Dom, where did that trace?" The silence on the other end of the line was not empty. It was full of something that Dom had been carrying since a Thursday morning in White Plains when a woman with a healing gunshot wound had asked him to keep showing up for the man who had left her in the rain. "Dom," Vincent said, "tell me." And Dom Farella, who had served the Moretti family for 30 years with complete loyalty, and who had finally decided that loyalty, like every contract, had its limits, said the one word that made Vincent's entire world shift 3 degrees on its axis in a way that nothing would ever fully correct. He said her name. Vincent didn't sleep. He sat in the dark apartment until the sky outside the window changed from black to the particular deep gray that precedes dawn, and he didn't move from the chair, and he didn't turn on the lights. And he didn't call anyone after he hung up with Dom because there was nothing left to say to Dom, and there was no one else he trusted enough to say anything to at all. He just sat there with the word Dom had spoken hanging in the air of the room like something with physical weight, like something that had altered the atmosphere of the space permanently and couldn't be unaltered by opening a window or turning on a fan or doing any of the ordinary things you do to change the quality of the air around you. Her name. He had heard it said in Dom's voice, and he had sat with it in the silence after Dom hung up. Dom, who never elaborated, who had given him exactly what he asked for and nothing more, which was its own kind of answer. And he had turned it over and over in his mind the way you turn something over when you're looking for the angle at which it stops being true, the angle at which it resolves into something more manageable, something that allows you to keep the story you've been telling yourself intact. He didn't find that angle. Because Dom Farella did not make mistakes about things like this. Dom was 63 years old and had been in this world since before Vincent was born, and had the particular quality of a man who has survived as long as he has precisely because he does not say things he is not certain of. If Dom had said her name, then it was her name. There was no version in which it wasn't. Vincent got up at 6 in the morning, he showered, he put on a suit. He drank coffee standing at the kitchen counter and stared at the wall and thought about Danielle's voice on the phone the night before, warm, slightly sleepy, completely available, and tried to map that voice against the thing he now knew and felt. The two things refused to connect, refused to sit in the same cognitive space without generating a kind of friction that was almost physical. He had given her access to his calendar. He had given her an apartment in Midtown. He had left Elena in the rain on Carver Street and crossed 15 feet of open ground toward the sound of Danielle's screaming. And the screaming had been real. He was almost certain the screaming had been real. The fear had looked real, but fear can be real and calculated at the same time. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and he knew this, had always known this, had used exactly this principle himself a dozen times across 20 years of work that required him to understand human behavior at its most instrumentalized. He had just never applied that understanding to her. He drove to Midtown at 7:30. He didn't call ahead. He used his key. The key she had given him. The key he had accepted as a gesture of intimacy, and which he now understood could be read as something else entirely, as the extension of access in both directions. And he let himself into the apartment and stood in the entrance hall and listened. She was awake. He could hear the shower running. He went to the kitchen and stood there and waited, and when the shower stopped, he waited some more. And when she came out in a robe with her hair wrapped in a towel, she saw him and stopped moving, and the expression on her face did a thing he had never seen it do before. It recalibrated. Very fast. Almost imperceptibly fast. But he saw it because he was looking for it now in a way he had never looked before. And what he saw in the half-second before her expression settled into something warm and surprised was the specific micro-adjustment of a person who has been caught off guard and is rapidly computing the appropriate response. "You scared me," she said. She smiled. "You should have called." "I had a key," he said. "I know." She came into the kitchen. She moved toward the coffee maker with the comfortable ease of a woman in her own space. "You want coffee? You look terrible." "Don't make coffee," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. The warmth in her expression was still there, but something behind it had gone very still, the way water goes still when something large moves beneath the surface. "Sit down," he said. "Vincent." "Sit down, Danielle." She sat at the kitchen table. She kept her hands folded in front of her, and her posture was very controlled, and her eyes were on him with an attention that was different from any attention she had given him before. Not the soft, interested attention of a woman listening to a man she wanted to keep engaged, but something harder and more interior, the attention of someone running calculations. He pulled a chair out and sat across from her and put his hands flat on the table the same way Marcus Tate had put his hands flat on the table in White Plains. And he understood now why that gesture meant what it meant. It was the gesture of a person who is about to tell the truth and wants the surface beneath them to be solid. "The calendar," he said. "The Carver Street meeting. Someone accessed the shared system from a tablet on this building's network 10 days before the ambush and cleared the immediate log, but not the version history." He watched her face. "The IP traces here." She didn't say anything. "The ambush was coordinated," he said. "The route, the vehicles, the timing. Whoever hit us on Carver Street knew exactly where we'd be and in what formation. That information came from my calendar." His voice was flat, even, the voice he used in rooms where emotion was a liability. "From this apartment." Danielle looked at him for a long moment. Then she unfolded her hands and placed them separately on the table, palms down, and the gesture was so deliberate and so controlled that it told him everything he needed to know about how long she had been prepared for this conversation. "You need to think very carefully about what you're accusing me of," she said. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Vincent said. "I'm telling you what the documentation shows." "Documentation can be wrong." "Version histories don't generate themselves," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The building around them made its ambient sounds, pipes, the distant mechanism of an elevator, the muffled urban texture of a city 7 floors below. Danielle looked at him steadily, and he looked back at her. And in that sustained mutual gaze, he felt the shape of the last 18 months rearrange itself around this new information, the way a landscape rearranges itself when you finally understand the topography. "Who were you feeding information to?" he said. "I want a lawyer," she said. The words hit him like a physical thing, not because they were unexpected. Some part of him had been preparing for this since Dom said her name, but because they were so precisely calibrated, so legally specific, that they confirmed in one syllable everything he had been hoping was wrong. Innocent people don't reach for lawyers in their kitchen at 7:45 in the morning when their boyfriend asks them a hard question. Guilty people reach for lawyers. Guilty people who have already thought about this moment reach for lawyers immediately and without hesitation because they've been advised to, because someone told them, when it comes, say those words first. "Who told you to say that?" Vincent said. "I'm not saying anything else," Danielle said. He stood up. He moved to the window. He put his back to her and looked out at the city and breathed through his nose in the long, deliberate way he had taught himself years ago as a management technique for moments when what his body wanted to do was not what the situation required. The city below was fully awake and indifferent, moving through its ordinary morning without any awareness that in a 7th-floor kitchen, a man was standing at the edge of the full weight of his own catastrophic misjudgment. He turned around. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Whatever arrangement you made, whoever you were working with, I can get ahead of it. If you tell me now completely, I can manage what happens next. But if I walk out of here and find it from somewhere else, I can't help you." He held her gaze. "I won't help you." Danielle looked at him. For a moment, something moved across her face that might have been something genuine, regret or fear, or the specific anguish of a person who has made a choice they can't unmake looking at the human cost of it sitting across a kitchen table. The moment lasted less than 2 seconds. Then her face closed. "I want a lawyer," she said again. He left. He was in the elevator before his phone buzzed. Marcus. He answered it. "We have a problem," Marcus said. I know, Vincent said. Not that problem, Marcus said. A different one. Greco and Benedetti called a meeting this morning without you. Vincent stopped breathing for exactly 1 second. Where? The Pelham house, Marcus said. Your house. He was there in 35 minutes. He came through the front door of the Pelham house with 2 of his men behind him and found Sal Benedetti and Tony Greco sitting at the long table in the main room with 2 of their respective captains flanking them. And the particular stillness that descended when he walked in was the stillness of men who have been having a conversation and have not finished it, and who are now deciding in real time whether to continue it in front of the person it concerns. This is my house, Vincent said. Benedetti stood. He was always the one who stood. We needed a space, he said. You needed a space, Vincent repeated. He looked around the room. He looked at the faces. He looked at Greco, who was watching him with the flat, assessing eyes of a man who has already decided something and is now simply observing to confirm it. In my house. Without telling me. We tried to reach you this morning, Greco said. His voice was measured and reasonable in the way that made it more offensive, not less. Multiple times. I was handling something, Vincent said. Yes, Greco said. We know. The way he said it, the specific weight of those 2 words, the way they implied a knowledge that extended beyond the surface of the statement, made Vincent go very still. He looked at Greco, and Greco looked back at him. And in that exchange was an entire conversation that neither of them was having out loud. What do you know, Tony? Vincent said. Greco glanced at Benedetti. Benedetti gave a small nod, the kind of nod that is an authorization rather than an agreement. Then Greco reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document and placed it on the table between them. The Calvino network reached out to us directly, Greco said. 3 days ago, not through you. Directly to us. He tapped the document. They're claiming that the Carver Street ambush was a response to a provocation, that someone from our side had been feeding them false intelligence about our operations for months, specifically to manufacture a justification for the hit. He paused. And they gave us the name of their source. Vincent looked at the document. He did not touch it. They gave us the name because their source has now gone dark, Greco said. She stopped communicating 2 weeks ago, and they believe she's preparing to run. They wanted us to know before she disappeared with the money and left us holding the consequences. The room was silent. Vincent could hear his own heartbeat with an unusual clarity, a measured biological sound that seemed to have no awareness of the scale of what was happening around it. She gave them 6 months of intelligence, Benedetti said. His voice was different now. Not the careful diplomatic tone of a man managing a relationship, but something harder and more stripped down. 6 months. She told them about the Philadelphia compression before we had internal consensus on our position. She told them about the Greco operations routing changes 3 weeks before they went into effect. She told them about Carver Street. He stopped. And she told them about the baby. Vincent's head came up. She told them Elena would be in the second vehicle, Benedetti said. She told them Elena was pregnant. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any of the silences that had come before in this room or in any room this morning. It was the silence of a man arriving at a truth that restructures everything around it, that makes every preceding version of events collapse into a single, definitive understanding that is both obvious and unbearable. She had known Elena was in the convoy. She had told them Elena was pregnant. And on the night of the ambush, when the bullets started, Danielle Reese had screamed. Real fear, real panic. He still believed that the body doesn't manufacture that register of terror easily. Because the plan had included her extraction, her safety. And when things went sideways and the extraction window compressed, she had done what people do when the plan stops working. She had reverted to pure animal survival and screamed for the man who had always come when she made that sound. And Vincent had come, and Elena had called his name, and he had not stopped. He sat down. He didn't decide to sit. His body just did it, the legs going out from under the voluntary system and finding the chair behind him without any instruction from the part of him that was supposed to be in charge of these things. He sat, and he put his hands on the table and he looked at them, at his own hands, which had built everything in this room and everything outside it. The hands of a man who had spent 20 years believing that his judgment was the most reliable instrument he possessed, and he felt something he had not felt since he was very young and powerless and unable to affect the things that were happening around him. He felt the specific vertigo of a man who has been completely, catastrophically wrong. "Where is she now?" he said. His voice sounded strange to him, thinner than usual. "We don't know," Greco said. "The Calvino people believe she pulled money from at least 2 of the accounts she had access to, probably more. They don't know how much." "She had access to the Midtown operational account," Vincent said. The words came out flat and automatic, the part of his brain that processed operational information still functioning independently of the part that was currently experiencing something close to structural collapse. And the Delaware holding entity, Curtis Webb set up the entities. She used Webb. He stopped. Webb is the link. He set up the shells. Benedetti and Greco exchanged a look. "We know about Webb," Benedetti said. "You know," Vincent said. "We've known about Webb for 6 weeks," Benedetti said. The information landed. Vincent looked at Benedetti. "6 weeks," he said. "We were trying to determine the extent of it before we brought it to you," Benedetti said. "We were trying to determine—" He stopped. He looked at Vincent with the expression of a man who has reached the part of the truth he least wanted to deliver. "We were trying to determine whether you knew." The room held that statement out in the open air. Whether you knew. Whether Vincent Moretti, the Roman, the man who had reorganized 4 operations and eliminated 2 rival families in a single fiscal quarter, had been either complicit in or oblivious to the systematic compromise of his own organization by a woman he had installed in a midtown apartment and given calendar access and spent 4 nights out of every 7 with while his wife lay in a hospital bed. The 2 options were equally disqualifying. One made him a traitor, the other made him a fool. "I didn't know," Vincent said. Benedetti nodded very slightly, in a way that said he was choosing to accept this and would continue choosing to accept it unless something else emerged to complicate it. "The money," Vincent said. "How much are we talking about?" "Webb is still working on a full accounting," Greco said. "Current estimate is between 3 and 4 million from the operational accounts, possibly more from the holding entities. Those are harder to trace quickly. 3 to 4 million, plus whatever the Calvino network had paid her, plus 6 months of intelligence that had allowed the rival syndicate to position itself advantageously across every major pressure point in the organization's eastern operations, plus the Carver Street ambush, which had killed 2 of his men, compromised the Philadelphia relationship beyond simple repair, and put a bullet through his pregnant wife's left side. He thought about Elena. He thought about Elena in the hospital room saying, "I'm not saying it twice," about Elena in the gray coat she'd owned since before they were married, about Elena planting trees in the garden in the first year of the Westchester house, her hands in the dirt, her hair loose, looking at what she was building with the particular focus she brought to everything she decided mattered. He thought about the 6 weeks she'd asked Sylvia Chen for, the 6 weeks she'd asked for 3 days after surgery from a hospital bed, with an IV in her arm and a dead daughter in some clinical record somewhere. 6 weeks she had not spent recovering in the conventional sense, but in some other sense that he had not been paying attention to because he had been spending 4 nights out of 7 in a midtown apartment feeding information to the woman who had fed his route to the people who fired the bullet. He thought about what Elena had been doing with those 6 weeks. He thought about Harold Voss and the 39 pages. He thought about the access log Marcus had pulled, which Marcus would not have pulled without being asked by someone with the standing to ask, and Marcus would not have taken that risk for himself alone. He thought about Dom coming to the Westchester house with food from the city, sitting at Elena's table, and he thought about what Elena had asked Dom to do, keep showing up for Vincent, exactly as always. And he understood now what that ask had actually been, what it had been designed to protect, what it had been buying time for. He stood up again. "I need to make a call," he said. "Vincent," Benedetti started. 10 minutes, Vincent said. "Give me 10 minutes. He went to the hallway. He stood by the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked out toward the back of the property, toward the garden that Elena had planted, and that had continued existing without either of them paying much attention to it through the worst months of both their lives. He dialed Elena's number. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. She didn't answer. He called Dom. Dom picked up on the second ring. "She's not answering," Vincent said. "No," Dom said. "Dom." He stopped. He pressed his hand flat against the window frame. The wood was cold. "Is she... Dom, has she already..." "Yes," Dom said, simply, without elaboration. Vincent stood very still. "When?" he said. "This morning," Dom said. "Early. Sylvia Chen was with her. They met with 2 federal agents at 7 a.m. 7 a.m. He had been sitting in Danielle's kitchen at 7:45. Elena had been sitting across from a federal prosecutor and 2 agents at 7 a.m. with 39 pages of financial documentation and an access log pulled from a version history and whatever else she had built in those 6 weeks, and she had handed it across a table the same way she did everything, quietly, completely, without announcing it in advance. "How long have you known this was coming?" Vincent said. Dom was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he said. "You were helping her," Vincent said. "I was watching," Dom said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," Dom said. "There is. I watched her build a case that protects the innocent people inside the operation and removes the ones who aren't. I watched her make decisions that you should have made 6 months ago." His voice was even and without apology. "I didn't help her do anything she wasn't going to do herself." Vincent leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the garden was still dormant, the same structural architecture of bare branches and covered beds he'd been looking at all winter without seeing. He thought about the trees Elena had planted. He thought about the fact that trees planted by someone who has left don't stop growing. "Where is she now?" he said. "Somewhere you won't find her until she decides you can," Dom said. Vincent stood at the window for a long time after Dom hung up. In the main room behind him, Benedetti and Greco and the captains were waiting with the Calvino document on the table and the full accounting of 6 months of catastrophic exposure and 3 to 4 million in missing operational funds, and the specific pending question of what happened to an organization when the man at the top has been simultaneously cuckolded, manipulated, financially compromised, and outmaneuvered by his own wife while he was busy not looking. He knew what happened. He had watched it happen to other men. He had, at various points in his career, been the mechanism by which it happened. He turned away from the window. He went back into the main room. He stood at the head of the table. Benedetti and Greco looked at him with the particular attention of men who are assessing whether the person in front of them is still the person they thought they were dealing with, whether there is still something here worth aligning with, or whether the calculation has shifted past the point of return. Vincent looked at both of them. He looked at the captains. He looked at the document on the table. He said, "I need to know exactly what the federal interest in our operations currently looks like." Greco glanced at Benedetti. "Because if Elena has already been in a room with federal agents this morning," Vincent said, "then I need to know what she gave them and what she didn't, and I need to know it before they decide how to use it." His voice was back to its operational register, flat and precise, but underneath it something had changed that the men in the room could feel without being able to fully name, a kind of pressure or urgency, or the specific desperation of a man who has finally seen the full shape of what he's up against and understands that the version of himself he's been operating as for the last 6 months is not equipped to meet it. "You think she's protecting some of us," Benedetti said. Carefully. "I think Elena doesn't do things without a reason," Vincent said. "And I think the reason she went to federal agents instead of going to your people directly has something to do with what she wants the outcome to look like." He paused. "And I think that outcome does not include me walking away from this." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the city, a woman in a gray coat sat in a car with a forensic accountant and a former federal prosecutor and watched the morning move through its ordinary hours, and did not check her phone, and did not wonder what Vincent was doing, and did not feel anything that resembled regret for the path she had chosen, because she had made her decision in the dark of a hospital room 3 days after surgery, and she had not changed it once in all the weeks since, and she was not going to change it now. She had given the federal agents 39 pages and an access log and the name Curtis Webb, and the full documented trail of $8.4 million and 6 months of intelligence leaks that led back, cleanly and irrefutably, to a calendar in a midtown apartment, and the man who had given someone access to it because he had confused availability with loyalty and proximity with truth. What she had not given them was everything. What she had kept back was specific and deliberate and shaped around a single purpose that Sylvia Chen had understood without needing it explained. Elena was not trying to destroy the organization. She was trying to excise the part of it that had rotted, preserve the part that could be saved, and ensure that the people inside it who had done nothing wrong were not consumed by the collapse of the parts that had. She had kept back the names of 17 employees in the legitimate businesses, the accountants, the operations managers, the logistics people who came to work every morning and did their jobs without any knowledge of what those jobs were actually adjacent to. She had kept back those names because she intended to need them. She intended to offer them a different future than the one that was currently converging on them from every direction. But first Vincent had to fall. And he was falling now in a house with a winter garden, surrounded by men who were deciding in real time whether to catch him or step back and let the ground come up to meet him at whatever speed physics required. And Elena Brooks was not in that room and was not watching and did not need to watch because she had set this in motion 11 weeks ago from a hospital bed, and it was moving now at its own speed and its own weight, and there was nothing left for her to push. She looked out the car window at the city. She thought about a room somewhere far from here with good light and a window that faced something worth looking at. She thought about what she was going to build. The federal agents came for Curtis Webb first. They took him at 6:40 in the morning from his apartment in Hoboken, 2 agents at the front door and 1 covering the building exit, efficient and unremarkable in the way that federal operations are unremarkable when they have been planned carefully and are not expecting resistance. Webb was 51, a soft-bodied man who had spent 20 years making himself useful to people who scared him, and when he saw the badges, he sat down on the edge of his bed without being asked and put his hands on his knees and started talking before they read him anything. He talked for 4 hours. Sylvia Chen sat in on the second hour with a federal prosecutor named David Okafor, who had been building peripheral cases on the Moretti organization for 3 years without getting close enough to the center to matter. What Webb gave them in that second hour moved Okafor closer to the center in 40 minutes than 3 years of peripheral work had managed. Webb knew the shell entities because he had built them. He knew the transfer routes because he had engineered them. He knew the access protocols for the calendar system because he had been the one to grant Danielle Reese the administrative adjacent permissions that she had used, exploiting a gap in the permission architecture that Webb had designed, possibly intentionally, possibly not, and his story shifted on this point in ways that Okafor noted without commenting on directly. What Webb did not know, and what became clear in the third hour, was the full scope of what Danielle had done with the access she had been given. He had understood it as a financial operation, the gradual movement of Moretti assets into accounts that Danielle controlled or had influence over, a slow-motion extraction that was meant to be completed and covered before anyone noticed. He had not known about the intelligence feeds to the Calvino network. He had not known about Carver Street. When Okafor put the ambush documentation in front of him and let him read it, Webb's face went through several colors and he asked for water and drank it with shaking hands and said, very quietly, "I didn't know anyone was going to get hurt." Okafor said nothing. Webb said it again, like saying it twice would change what it meant. Okafor said, "Tell me about the Calvino contact. Who made the introduction?" Webb didn't know the Calvino contact directly, but he knew the name of the intermediary, a man named Ferris who worked in logistics for a shipping company in Newark that the Moretti organization had legitimate contracts with, which was how the channel had been established without triggering obvious flags. Ferris was the bridge between Danielle and the Calvino network, and Ferris had been compensated through a subsidiary account that Webb could trace in his sleep. By noon, Okafor had warrants in 3 jurisdictions. By 2 in the afternoon, Ferris was in a federal building in Manhattan giving his own account, which differed from Webb's in several details and agreed with it in all the ones that mattered. By 4 in the afternoon, the picture was complete enough that Okafor called Sylvia Chen into his office and closed the door and said, "Your client's documentation is cleaner than anything we've built internally in 3 years. Tell me what she wants." Sylvia had been waiting for this question. She had prepared for it the way Elena had prepared everything. Specifically, completely, without leaving gaps. She wants the 17 employees in the legitimate businesses immunized, Sylvia said. Administrative staff, operations managers, logistics coordinators, people who worked in good faith inside structures they didn't control. She has their names, their roles, their documentation of ordinary employment. Okafor said, "That's manageable. What else?" She wants the legitimate business assets separated from the criminal enterprise assets in the forfeiture proceedings, Sylvia said. The restaurants, the property management company, the 2 import businesses. She wants those preserved as going concerns. Okafor looked at her. She planning to run them. She's planning to transform them, Sylvia said, into something that doesn't require federal oversight to stay clean. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He was 44, a precise man who had come up through white-collar financial crime before moving into organized crime prosecution, and he had the particular quality of someone who understood that the best outcomes in complex cases were not always the ones that looked most complete on paper. He thought about 3 years of peripheral work and the 40 minutes of Webb's testimony that had moved him further than all of it. And Moretti himself, he said. She's not asking for anything specific on Moretti, Sylvia said. She doesn't need to, Okafor said. The financial documentation alone is enough. I know, Sylvia said. He nodded. He picked up his pen. He started writing. I'll have the immunity agreements drafted by end of business, he said, and I'll need her available for a follow-up conversation in the next 48 hours. Sylvia stood. She'll be available. She walked out of the federal building into a gray afternoon and called Elena from the sidewalk, standing with her back to the building and her coat pulled closed against the cold. It's done, Sylvia said. Okafor took everything. Elena was quiet for a moment, then she said, the 17 names. Agreed, Sylvia said. And the legitimate businesses. Another pause. When do they move on him? 48 hours, Sylvia said. Maybe less. Elena said, all right. She hung up. She was sitting in a rented apartment in Stamford, Connecticut. Not the Westchester house, not the city, somewhere intermediate and anonymous that Dom had arranged through a contact who owed him something old and unremarkable. The apartment had a kitchen table and a window that faced a parking lot and nothing on the walls, and she had been living in it for 4 days with 2 bags, her laptop, and the gray coat that she hung on the back of the door every evening and put on again every morning. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after hanging up. She thought about 48 hours. She thought about what Vincent was doing right now, in the 30-something hours before Okafor's warrants arrived, and whether he knew what was coming, and whether knowing would change anything or whether the machinery she had set in motion was simply too complete to be interrupted by whatever he might try. She thought it was too complete, but she thought about it anyway. Vincent knew. He had known since the morning Dom told him Elena had been in a federal office at 7 a.m., and in the 30 hours since then, he had moved through several distinct phases of response with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose survival instincts are still functioning even when everything else has stopped making sense. He had spent the first 4 hours getting his financial and legal exposure mapped by the family's attorneys, 2 of whom told him, in the careful circumlocutory language of lawyers who are about to deliver catastrophic news, that the documentation Elena had provided was likely sufficient to support charges across multiple statutes, and that his options were, frankly, limited. He had spent the next 3 hours on the phone with people who could not help him, learning that they could not help him. He had spent an hour sitting in his car outside the Pelham house, watching the garden through the windshield. Then he had driven to Stamford. He didn't know about the rented apartment specifically, but he knew Dom, and he knew the geography of the kind of favors Dom called in, and he had spent 20 years learning the patterns of how people in his world moved when they didn't want to be found, and those patterns had a grammar he could still read even when everything else was coming apart. He made 3 calls. Not to people Elena would have anticipated he'd call, people at the edges of Dom's network rather than the center, and the 3rd call gave him an address. He drove there at 10 in the evening. He didn't bring anyone with him. He left Polly at the house and drove himself, which was something he almost never did. And the act of driving, the physical engagement of it, hands on the wheel, the specific attentiveness required, was the only thing that felt like it was keeping him inside his own skin. He knocked on the apartment door. Elena opened it. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. She had heard the car in the parking lot. She had looked through the window and seen him get out and stand for a moment with his hand on the roof of the car and his face turned upward toward the building. And she had thought about not opening the door and had rejected that option because it was not who she was. She opened the door and she looked at him and he looked back at her, and they stood there in the doorway with 10 feet of cold air between them and the whole accumulated weight of everything that had happened in the last 4 months pressing down on the moment like a physical force. He looked terrible. She had thought he looked terrible in the hospital room 2 days after Carver Street, when he had sat in the chair and said he was sorry in the way that people say it when they mean it, but also know it doesn't reach. He looked worse than that now. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had stopped taking care of the basic physical maintenance of himself. Unshaved, his suit jacket gone, his shirt collar open, his eyes carrying the particular hollowness of someone who has been operating on adrenaline past the point where adrenaline is still useful. "How did you find this place?" she said. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me." "Randall Voss," he said. "He owes Dom from something in 2019. Dom didn't tell me, but I know how Dom's debts work." Elena filed this information and would deal with it separately. "What do you want, Vincent?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Can I come in?" She considered it. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in the middle of the empty apartment and looked at the kitchen table with the laptop on it and the gray coat on the back of the door and the 2 bags against the wall and the nothing on the walls and the parking lot through the window, and all of it was so specifically, painfully unlike any version of Elena's life that he had known that it hit him in a way he hadn't expected. Not the luxury of the Westchester house or the city apartment, but Elena herself distilled to her essential components, what she actually needed versus what he had told himself she needed. And the two were so different that the gap between them felt like an accusation. "Sit down," she said. She said it without particular warmth and without cruelty. Just practical. He sat at the kitchen table. She stood across from it, leaning against the counter, her arms folded. She was in dark jeans and a sweater, and her hair was loose, and she had the particular self-containment she always had, that settled quality that he had always read as calm and was now understanding, possibly for the first time, as something more active than calm. Not peace. Preparation. "I know what you gave Okafor," he said. "Good," she said. "The financial documentation. The access log. Webb's name." "Yes," she said. "And you kept back the 17 employees," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." "Why?" he said. "Because they're innocent," she said. "Because the work they do is real work, and the businesses they work in can be real businesses, and none of that requires them to pay for choices they didn't make." He put his hands flat on the table. They were shaking slightly, which she noticed, and which he probably didn't. "You're going to take the businesses," he said. "I'm going to transform them," she said. "There's a difference." "Elena, don't," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It just got more precise, the way a blade gets more precise the closer you look at it. "Don't say my name like that, like I'm doing something to you. You understand what you did. You sat in that chair in the hospital and said you were sorry, and I believe you were sorry. But sorry is not the same as facing what it is." He was quiet. "You heard me call your name," she said, "on Carver Street, in the rain, while your daughter was still alive inside me." Her voice stayed level. This was the most terrifying thing about it. How level it stayed, how completely controlled, how there was no performance in it, no bid for sympathy, just the plain factual weight of what she was saying laid out on the table between them like the 39 pages of financial documentation. "You heard me, and you didn't stop. And she died. And you went to her apartment." Vincent said nothing. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel it," Elena said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand what this is. This isn't revenge. I don't want revenge. Revenge would have been calling Okafor the day I got out of the hospital. Revenge would have been letting Benedetti and Greco and all of them figure out for themselves what Danielle had done, and letting whatever they do about that happen without any documentation or legal protection for anyone." She paused. "What I did," she said, is surgery. I removed what was sick and I protected what was healthy, and I gave everyone involved, including your captains, including your men, including the people who worked in your businesses and never knew what they were adjacent to, a chance at something that doesn't end in a federal building. She looked at him steadily. Okafor is going to come for you. That was always going to happen. What I did was make sure it stops with you. Vincent sat at the kitchen table in a rented apartment in Stamford, with a parking lot outside the window, and looked at the woman he had married 7 years ago and felt something shift inside him with the irreversibility of structural change. Not emotional, or not only emotional, but something more fundamental, like the load-bearing part of a building finally giving way, the part that had been absorbing weight that it was never designed to carry. And the collapse wasn't violent or sudden, but simply final in the way that final things are. She knew you were in the convoy, but, he said. It wasn't a question. He needed to say it out loud, in this room, with Elena standing 3 feet away. Yes, Elena said. She told them you were pregnant. Yes. He put his hand over his mouth. He breathed through his nose. He sat there for a long moment that stretched and stretched. I didn't know, he said. I need you to know that I didn't know she was... I know you didn't know, Elena said. Then why? Because not knowing isn't the same as not being responsible, she said. You gave her access to your life, Vincent, to your calendar, to your operations, to your bed, to the convoy schedule that put your pregnant wife in the second vehicle on Carver Street. You gave her all of that. She paused. The bullet she arranged. You handed her the gun. The silence after that was the longest silence of the evening. Vincent stood up. He didn't have anywhere to go, but he stood anyway because sitting felt like something he couldn't keep doing. He moved to the window and looked at the parking lot and pressed his hand against the cold glass, the same way he had pressed it against the window at the Pelham house that morning, looking for something solid. Is there anything, he said, anything I can do? Anything that changes? No, Elena said, simply. Elena. No, Vincent. Still level. Still precise. There isn't anything. I'm not saying that cruelly. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve the truth rather than false comfort. She paused. What's coming is coming. Okafor has what he needs. The warrants are in process. By tomorrow morning or the morning after, it will begin. He turned from the window. He looked at her. And you? I'll be somewhere else, she said. Where? Somewhere that isn't here, she said. Somewhere that isn't anything you've touched. Somewhere I can start with clean ground. He looked at her face. He had looked at this face for 7 years, across tables and in the dark and in arguments and in the specific ordinary light of 2 people living their lives in proximity, and he knew it the way you know a face you have seen across 1,000 different versions of a single day. And what he saw in it now was something he had always known was there, but had not looked at directly. The absolute self-containment of a woman who had never needed him to complete anything about her, who had been a whole and sufficient person before he came and would be one after, and who had extended him the gift of her presence, and he had taken it and used it as furniture, as backdrop, as the stable surface against which to conduct the unsteady business of his actual priorities. He had needed her to be there so that he didn't have to think about whether she was there. He understood this now with a clarity that was devastating in the specific way of things understood too late. Danielle, he said, do you know where she is? Elena shook her head. She ran, she said. That's all I know. Okafor has people looking. If she gets out of the country, she won't, Elena said. The financial documentation traces the account she moved money into. Okafor has the account information. It limits where she can surface without triggering a flag. She paused. She's going to be found, Vincent, probably within days. He nodded. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and she watched him from across the room with the same quiet attention she had given him since she opened the door. Not cold, not forgiving, just present in the particular way she was present, which had always been more complete than he deserved. The baby, he said. He couldn't say her name because they had never agreed on one. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't... Go, Vincent, Elena said. He went. She heard his footsteps on the outside stairs. She heard the car door. She heard the engine. She stood in the middle of the empty apartment and listened to the sound of his car leaving the parking lot, and then there was only the ambient quiet of a building at night, the distant sounds of the interstate, the refrigerator cycling on, ordinary life continuing in all its indifferent completeness. She did not cry. She went to the kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She pulled up a document she had been working on for 3 days. A structural plan for the transition of the 4 legitimate businesses, detailed and specific, the kind of document that requires research and legal consultation and a clear vision of what the transformed entity is supposed to become. She had been building it in the evenings after Sylvia's calls, in the hours when there was nothing left to do in the active sense and the only thing available was the future. She read through what she had written. She made 2 corrections. She continued. Outside, the night was fully dark and the parking lot was empty, and somewhere in the city, Vincent Moretti was driving back to a house that already felt like somewhere he used to live, in a car that was already beginning to feel like something borrowed, toward a morning that was going to arrive with federal agents and documents and the specific irreversible machinery of institutional accountability that Elena had set in motion from a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a decision already made. She typed. She was still typing when her phone buzzed at midnight. Sylvia, a text, 3 words. Warrant signed today. She read it. She put the phone face down. She kept typing. At 12:47 a.m., 230 miles south in a mid-range hotel near Philadelphia International Airport, Danielle Reese was standing at the window of a room she had paid for in cash, looking at the runway lights in the distance with a passport in one hand and a phone in the other and a rolling bag by the door that contained $460,000 in a combination of currency and negotiable instruments, and the specific weightless confidence of a woman who has been planning this exit for 6 months and believes that planning is the same as control. She had a flight at 5:50 a.m., private charter, arranged through a contact in the Cayman Islands who knew how to move people without leaving the kind of paper trail that ordinary travel generates. She had been here before in her mind, this exact room, this exact window, this exact waiting, and in her mind it had always resolved cleanly into the next thing. The flight, the island, the account, the beginning of a life that bore no relationship to the one she was leaving. She was so close. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She almost let it go to voicemail and turned back to the window and waited for 5:50 a.m., the way she had been waiting for 5:50 a.m. in her head for 6 months. She answered it. The voice on the other end said her name. Not Danielle. Her real name. The name on the birth certificate that predated the reinvention. The name she had stopped using 11 years ago when she had understood that the person she wanted to become required a different architecture of identity than the one she'd been born into. She felt her chest contract. "Who is this?" she said. "That's not the right question," the voice said. "The right question is whether you think a charter flight arranged through a Cayman contact is actually off the federal radar when the federal agents requesting your location have access to the same financial documentation that traces your accounts." She moved away from the window. "The accounts are flagged," the voice said. "Every institution holding funds you moved in the last 90 days has been served with a notification. The charter company was contacted 2 hours ago. Your pilot filed a report 40 minutes ago." A pause. "You're not leaving tonight, Danielle, and you're not leaving tomorrow. The only question is whether you walk out of that hotel and into a federal building on your own terms, or whether you wait for them to come to the room." Her hand on the phone was shaking. "Who is this?" she said again. Her voice was different now, smaller. The voice said, "Someone who wanted you to know that the plan stopped working a long time ago, and that the woman you tried to kill in a rainstorm on Carver Street is the reason you know it." The line went dead. Danielle stood in the center of the hotel room with the passport in her hand and the rolling bag by the door and the runway lights still moving in the distance, and felt, for the first time in 6 months, the full physical weight of what it means to be completely, utterly cornered. Not by a person, not by a system, but by the specific and irresistible consequence of having underestimated the wrong woman at the worst possible time. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put the passport on the nightstand. She picked up her phone again, and after a long moment in which she sat completely still and breathed through the specific and final recognition that the exit she had planned with such precision and patience and confidence was gone, she dialed the number for David Okafor's office and waited for someone to answer. Danielle Reese walked into the federal building in Philadelphia at 2:17 in the morning. She came alone, without an attorney, without luggage, with only the passport still in her coat pocket and the phone in her hand, and the specific hollowed-out quality of a person who has been running so hard for so long that the moment the running stops, the body doesn't know what to do with the stillness. She gave her name at the security desk, her real name, the one from the birth certificate, the one the voice on the phone had used. And she sat in a holding room with a paper cup of water she didn't drink and waited for the people who were coming. And when they came, she looked at David Okafor across the table and said, "I want a deal." And Okafor said, "Tell me everything first." And she did. She talked for 6 hours. She started at the beginning, which was not the charity dinner where she had met Vincent, but 14 months before that, in a coffee shop in Hoboken where a man named Ferris had sat across from her and explained, in language that was careful and reasonable and entirely without menace, that she had certain skills and certain access, and that certain people were willing to compensate her very well for the application of those skills to a specific and time-limited project. She had understood what he was asking. She had said yes without taking more than 48 hours to decide, which told her something about herself that she had chosen not to examine too closely then, and was examining now, in this room, under these lights, with nowhere else to look. She talked about the calendar access, about Curtis Webb, about the shell entities, about the 6 months of intelligence she had fed through Ferris to the Calvino network. She talked about the operational details she had passed along, the routing changes, the Philadelphia position, the Carver Street meeting. She talked about the money, all of it, every account and every amount, with the precision of someone who has spent months keeping meticulous mental records, because she always understood that the records might one day be the most valuable thing she had. She talked about Carver Street. She talked about what she had told the Calvino network about the convoy configuration and Elena's presence and Elena's pregnancy. She said this part quickly and without looking at Okafor, her eyes on the table, her voice flat and even, because the alternative to saying it quickly and flatly was not saying it at all, and she had made the decision to say everything, and she was keeping that decision. Okafor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her with the particular expression of a prosecutor who has heard a great many confessions and has developed the capacity to receive them without being visibly moved, which was a professional skill, but also, in this instance, a mercy, because what his face might have shown if he had let it was not something Danielle Reese needed to see in this room at 4 a.m. He said, "The woman in the convoy, the one who was shot, she survived." "I know," Danielle said. "She lost the baby," Okafor said. Danielle said nothing. She looked at the table. Her jaw was set, and her hands were flat on the surface in front of her, and she was breathing with the careful regularity of someone managing something that wants to be unmanageable. And Okafor watched her do it, and then said, "All right, here's what a deal looks like." He talked for 20 minutes. She listened. The deal was not generous, it was functional, which in the context of everything she had described in the preceding 6 hours was the best available outcome. And she knew this, and she accepted it without negotiating because she had sat in a hotel room in Philadelphia and understood with complete clarity that the leverage she had imagined herself to have had dissolved in the moment she answered an unknown phone call and heard her real name said by a voice that knew exactly where she was and exactly what she was about to attempt. She signed the cooperation agreement at 5:40 a.m., 11 minutes before her charter flight would have departed without her. The arrests came at 7 in the morning. They came for Vincent at the Pelham house, where he had returned after leaving Stamford and had sat in the kitchen until dawn without sleeping, and had then gone upstairs and changed his clothes and come back down and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden in the specific way of a man who has already accepted what is coming and is using the remaining time to look at things he is about to stop being able to look at. He heard the cars in the driveway. He set down his coffee. He went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. There were 4 agents. Okafor was not among them. The lead agent was a woman named Reyes, mid-30s, who presented the warrant with the practiced efficiency of someone doing a job she has done before and will do again, and who brings to it neither enthusiasm nor cruelty, but simply the steady professionalism of institutional process. Vincent looked at the warrant. He looked at Reyes. He said, "Give me a minute." Reyes said, "Take it." He went back inside. He stood in the kitchen for 60 seconds. He looked at the garden one more time through the window. The bare trees, the covered beds, the structural forms of things Elena had planted in the first year they owned this house. Things that had continued growing through everything and would continue growing after, indifferent and alive. He thought about the daughter who had not been named. He thought about the specific weight of a choice made in 2 seconds in the rain on Carver Street, a weight that had been accumulating ever since with the patient arithmetic of consequence, arriving now in the form of 4 federal agents in his driveway, and a warrant with his name on it, and the full documented architecture of 20 years of choices laid out in 39 pages of Elena's meticulous work. He went back to the front door. He put his hands out. Reyes cuffed him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this gesture carries no particular drama, and he walked to the federal vehicle with his head up and his jaw set and his eyes straight ahead, and the garden was behind him, and he did not turn around to look at it again. They took Curtis Webb the same morning, a second formal arrest following his voluntary appearance and subsequent cooperation. Webb's attorney had negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for the testimony he had already given, and the process of his formal processing was administrative and swift. He sat in a waiting room and filled out forms and did not make eye contact with anyone, and was released on bail by noon. A small and diminished figure moving through the institutional machinery of his own accountability with the particular invisibility of a man who has made himself useful enough to the right people to avoid the worst, and not useful enough to anyone to avoid all of it. Ferris was picked up at his home in Newark at 7:30. He did not go quietly, which surprised no one and changed nothing. He was processed, arraigned, and assigned a public defender by early afternoon, and the cooperation he eventually provided, 2 weeks later, after his own attorney had laid out the evidence against him with the clarity that evidence of that quality demands, would close the last remaining gap in Okafor's case, the specific Calvino network connection that linked the intelligence feeds directly to the ambush planning and established the conspiracy charge that was the heaviest count on the indictment. The Calvino network's exposure was handled through a separate proceeding in Philadelphia, coordinated with the federal office there, and that process took months and produced its own arraignments and cooperation agreements and eventual resolutions, none of which touched Elena directly, and all of which proceeded from the documentation she had provided and the chain of evidence she had established with Harold Voss's work and Marcus Tate's access log and her own 6 weeks of methodical, unhurried, completely self-directed preparation. Sal Benedetti and Tony Greco were interviewed twice each, provided documentary cooperation that fell short of criminal exposure for either of them, and emerged from the proceedings as men who had been adjacent to catastrophe without being consumed by it, which was its own kind of outcome, and which both of them understood well enough to be grateful for without anyone having to say so explicitly. Dom Farello was not charged with anything. This was not an accident. Sylvia Chen had made 3 specific representations to Okafor during the initial briefing that established Dom's position clearly, that his knowledge of certain operational matters predated the period under investigation, that his cooperation with Elena's documentation effort had been passive rather than active, and that his most recent conduct had been consistently oriented toward protecting the innocent employees and limiting the organization's exposure to the kind of violence that the Calvino connection had introduced. Okafor had accepted these representations because the evidence supported them, and because Okafor was, above all, a man interested in the truth rather than the largest possible indictment, which was part of what made him good at his job. Dom was told by Sylvia Chen, through an intermediary, that he was not going to be charged. He received this information at his kitchen table in Carroll Gardens on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a long time before standing up and making himself breakfast, which he ate slowly and with the particular attention of a man who has been reminded that ordinary life continues and requires ordinary maintenance. He thought about Elena. He thought about the Thursday morning in White Plains when she had sat across from him in a coffee shop with a healing gunshot wound and asked him to keep showing up for Vincent exactly as always, and the specific cost of that ask, And the way she had looked at him when she made it, not asking for sympathy, not performing vulnerability, just one person asking another person a hard thing and trusting them with the full weight of what it meant. He had kept up his end. He hoped she knew that. She knew. She learned about the arrest through Sylvia, who called at 7:15 that morning, and she sat at the kitchen table in the Stamford apartment with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked at the parking lot for a long time. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it came through at this time of year, flat and gray and without particular warmth, and it fell across the table and across her hands and across the laptop where the structural plan for the business transition was still open from the night before. She felt the weight of the morning, all of it, everything it contained and everything it resolved and everything it didn't. Because resolution is not the same as restoration, and she had been clear-eyed about this from the beginning, from the moment in the hospital when she had made her decision in the dark and understood that what came after was not going to be recovery in the conventional sense of returning to a prior state. There was no prior state to return to. The prior state was gone. The daughter who would have been named something was gone. The 7 years of a marriage that had been real, that had contained real things, real mornings and real decisions and real investment of self, that was gone too, not because it had never existed, but because the man she had built it with had made a choice in 2 seconds in the rain that had revealed, with the precision of a medical instrument, the exact hierarchy of his commitments. She sat with all of it. She did not try to resolve it into something more manageable than it was. Then she picked up her phone and called Harold Voss. "I need you in Greenwich by Thursday," she said when he answered. "We're starting the transition work on the property management company first. It's the cleanest of the 4, and I want to establish the template there before we move to the others." Voss said, "I'll be there." She hung up. She called Sylvia. "The immunity agreements for the 17 employees," she said. "How long before those are finalized?" "Okafor's office said end of week," Sylvia said. "I want them notified before the news cycle reaches them," Elena said. "They deserve to hear it from a person, not from their phones." "I'll coordinate," Sylvia said. "And Marcus," Elena said. A brief pause. "He's already made arrangements. He's out, Elena, clean. He's going back to the private sector." "Good," she said. "He earned it." She closed the laptop. She stood up. She went to the door and took down the gray coat and put it on and went outside into the cold morning air, which hit her face with the specific clarity of outdoor air in November, sharp and unambiguous. And she stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed it in. She had a meeting at 9 with a commercial real estate attorney in Greenwich who had been recommended by one of the contacts she had developed during the preceding weeks. A woman named Patricia Osei, who specialized in business acquisitions and had the reputation specifically for bringing rigor and creativity to the transformation of distressed commercial assets into functioning, sustainable enterprises. Elena had spoken with her once on the phone, 15 minutes, enough to know that Patricia Osei was the kind of person she needed: practical, unsentimental, interested in outcomes rather than appearances. She got in the car. She drove. The meeting lasted 2 hours and covered the structural framework for converting the property management company from its current organizational form into a registered benefit corporation, a legal structure that built accountability to a broader set of stakeholders directly into the company's charter, and that would, when combined with the financial restructuring that Voss was planning, create something that bore almost no resemblance to what it had been, other than the physical assets it managed and the employees who had been doing the actual work all along. Elena sat across from Patricia Osei in a conference room with large windows and a view of the street and talked through the specifics with the particular focus she brought to things that mattered. She asked precise questions. She pushed back twice on points where she disagreed. She took notes in her own hand, small and neat in the margins of the documents Patricia had prepared, the kind of notes that are for yourself rather than for anyone else. At the end of the 2 hours, Patricia Osei looked at her across the conference table with the expression of someone who has been doing this work long enough to know the difference between people who are building something and people who are dismantling something, and said, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." "Long enough," Elena said. "The other 3 businesses," Patricia said. "You're planning the same structure." "Modified for each one," Elena said. "The restaurants are different from the import businesses. The import businesses are different from the property management, but yes, same underlying principle." Which is what exactly? Patricia said. In plain language. Elena thought about it for a moment. Then she said that the people who do the actual work should benefit from it, and that the structure of a business should make it harder to do the wrong thing, not easier. Patricia nodded slowly. That's going to take at least 18 months, probably 24. I know, Elena said. I'm not in a hurry. She drove back to Stamford in the early afternoon. She stopped at a grocery store and bought actual food, not the provisional, functional supplies she had been living on since arriving in the apartment, but real ingredients, the kind that required actual preparation, an act of ordinary domestic intention that she recognized, as she put things in the basket, as a small but specific signal from herself to herself about what was happening, about the difference between surviving a thing and beginning the thing that comes after. She cooked dinner that evening. It was nothing elaborate, pasta, a sauce she'd been making for years, a salad, but the act of making it, the physical engagement of it, the smells and the heat and the particular sensory normalcy of standing at a stove doing something that had nothing to do with any of what had happened in the last 4 months, was something she needed in a way she hadn't known she needed until she was in the middle of it. She ate at the kitchen table with the laptop open but not looked at. She ate slowly. She drank half a glass of wine. Outside, the evening was dark and the parking lot was lit with the amber wash of the security lights, and it was all completely ordinary, which was what she had needed it to be. She thought about the Westchester house. She would sell it. There was no version in which she returned to it as a place to live. Too much of it was the architecture of a life she was no longer inside of. Too many rooms organized around the presence of a person who had been carrying on a parallel existence inside their shared one. And too much of the land and the garden and the light through the windows was the residue of hope she had stopped being able to maintain for that particular structure. But she would sell it carefully, to people who would live in it, who would use the garden, who would plant things in the beds she had covered for winter. She wanted it to continue being a house where things grew. She thought about the daughter who would not be named. She thought about this the way she had taught herself to think about it in the hospital and in the weeks since, not pushing it away, not dwelling in it, but allowing it to be present in the way that a permanent thing is present, simply there, simply true. Simply part of the architecture of who she was now, in a way it had not been before, and would never stop being. The loss did not require constant attention, but it required acknowledgement, and she gave it that quietly at the kitchen table with the half glass of wine and the ordinary evening around her. She had wanted that child. She had wanted to know her. She had imagined her, not in detail, not with a name or a face or a specific personality, but in the general sense of another person arriving into the world and requiring things of her and becoming known over time, the slow, particular joy of that. She had imagined it, and it had been taken away, not by accident, but by the compound result of choices made by people who had been in positions of trust and had used those positions for something else. She held that knowledge. She did not let it become hatred, because hatred required maintenance that she preferred to put toward other things. But she held it honestly, without softening it into something more bearable than it was, because Elena Brooks had never been a woman who found false comfort useful, and she was not going to become one now. The Moretti case moved through the federal system with the kind of momentum that well-documented cases generate when the documentation is as clean as the documentation Elena had provided. Vincent was arraigned on 14 counts covering financial crimes, conspiracy, and racketeering. His attorneys entered a not guilty plea as a matter of procedural form, knowing full well that the evidence made trial a poor strategic option, and over the following weeks they worked toward a plea agreement that would resolve the most serious counts in exchange for a full cooperation on the organizational structure and the remaining asset accounting. Vincent cooperated. He did this without being asked to by Elena, without any signal from her direction, without any negotiation of benefit for himself that involved her name or her interests or her businesses. He did it because his attorneys told him it was the only rational path, and because he had sat in a kitchen in Stamford at 11 at night and heard Elena say what she said, and he had walked to his car in the parking lot and driven back to the Pelham house and watched the dawn come up over the garden. And somewhere in that drive or in that dawn, he had made a decision that was the quietest and most private decision of his adult life, to stop explaining himself to himself. He pled guilty to 7 counts. The The sentence was 12 years, with possibility of parole review at 8. He was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania in early spring. He did not ask to see Elena before the transfer. He sent a single letter through Sylvia Chen, which Sylvia forwarded with a neutral note that said only that it had arrived and that Elena was free to read it or not as she chose. Elena set it on the kitchen table in the new apartment she had moved into in Greenwich. A real apartment now, not the provisional Stamford space, with proper furniture and a window that faced a courtyard where something was beginning to grow in the planters despite the lingering cold. She looked at the envelope for 3 days before opening it. The letter was 1 page, handwritten, in Vincent's specific cramped script that she recognized from 7 years of notes left on kitchen counters and margins of documents and the occasional card that arrived on her birthday. He had not written much. He had written that he understood that she had not done what she did to destroy him, even though it had destroyed him, and that he recognized the distinction. He had written that he knew about the 17 employees, and that what she had done for them was... And here the sentence stopped and started again differently, as though he had written a word and crossed it out and chosen another, more than he would have thought to do, and better. He had written, near the bottom of the page, one sentence that she read several times. I didn't lose the empire because of my enemies. I lost it the night I made my choice in the rain, and the rest was just the distance between the choice and the landing. The last line said, I know you won't write back. I'm not asking you to. She put the letter down. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inner pocket of the gray coat, and did not read it again, but did not throw it away either, because she was Elena Brooks, and she kept things that mattered, even the hard ones. Even the ones that carried weight she would rather not carry, because she had learned in 4 months that had cost her more than most people pay in a lifetime, that the things that matter most are usually the ones that cost the most to hold. 6 months after the arrests, on a morning in late spring, with the kind of light that makes everything look like it has been recently cleaned, Elena drove to the first of the 17 employees' orientation sessions for the newly restructured benefit corporation. The session was held in the back room of one of the restaurants, one of the 4 legitimate businesses, now legally separated from the criminal enterprise history, now operating under new organizational documents and a new board structure that Elena had spent 8 months building with Patricia Osei and Harold Voss, and 2 other advisors she had found and trusted. The room held 11 people that morning: office staff, a bookkeeper, 2 operations coordinators, the restaurant manager who had been running the kitchen for 9 years without knowing what the ownership structure behind his restaurant actually was. Elena stood at the front of the room and looked at these 11 people and felt something she had not let herself feel for a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. A sense of direction and purpose that was clean in the specific way that things are clean when they are not entangled with anything corrupt. She talked for an hour. She explained the new structure, the ownership stake that each employee would be granted through the transition, the board representation, the community investment mandate that was now written into the corporate charter. She answered questions with the direct specificity that the questions deserved, not softening anything, not overselling anything, not performing optimism she didn't feel. At the end, the bookkeeper, a woman in her 50s named Gloria, who had been with the property management company for 11 years, raised her hand and said, "Are you going to be running this yourself, or are you bringing in outside management?" Elena looked at her. "I'm running it myself," she said. Gloria nodded, and in her nod was the particular quality of a person deciding to trust something, which was not a small thing, which was in fact one of the larger things one person can extend to another, and Elena received it with the gravity it deserved. She drove home after the session through the late morning city, windows down despite the cool air, taking a route that went past the river, and she thought about the last year, and all it had contained, and all it had taken, and all it had, in the strange and costly arithmetic of terrible things, given her, a clarity she would not have chosen and would not trade, a self she recognized more completely than any self she had lived in before, a set of capabilities and a set of losses that were now inseparable from each other, woven into the same fabric, permanent. She parked outside the Greenwich apartment. She sat in the car for a moment. The courtyard planters were visible from where she parked. The things growing in them had continued growing, small and persistent and indifferent to the cold they had come through, putting out new growth in the specific green of things that have decided to keep going regardless. She got out of the car. She went inside. She took off the gray coat and hung it on the back of the door. She went to the window and stood there for a moment in the quiet of an ordinary late morning, looking at the courtyard, looking at the planters, looking at the green things that were growing in them without any particular dramatic announcement, just growing the way things grow when the conditions finally allow it. She was 35 years old. She had lost a marriage, a daughter, the structure of a life she had built for 7 years on ground that had turned out to be someone else's. And she had survived all of it. Not because surviving is easy, or because she was built differently from other people, but because she had made a decision in a dark hospital room and had kept making it every day since, quietly and without ceremony, the same way she did everything that mattered. She had work to do this afternoon. She had calls to make and documents to review and a conversation scheduled with Patricia Osei about the second business conversion and all the specific ordinary machinery of building something real in the world, which required attention and time and the willingness to show up every day without knowing exactly what the day would produce. She turned away from the window. She sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She began.